Corentin Harrow slammed the creaking door. The house shuddered with it, as if the timber itself remembered the sound of a long-ago musket shot. A wall clock ticked with stubborn patience, and a thin rain rattled the windows like a stray musket ball ricocheting off iron. Inside, the room breathed dust and memory. Corentin stood in the doorway for a moment, the edge of the shawl he wore catching on a nail, the fabric smelling of old wool and rain-soaked years. A flicker of flame fought the coal stove, throwing a pale yellow halo over his chair, and the man who had come to listen, and to listen, only, though the room itself seemed to lean toward, him as if listening too. On the threadbare chair across from him sat a young reporter, barely old enough to remember a civil war that had been just a rumor or a nightmare in the night for him. The reporter's notebook lay open like an unwilling confession of his own, and his eyes, bright with the stubborn glow of curiosity, never quite met Corentin's. Instead, dancing along the lines of the old veteran's face as if reading a map of scars and stories, the rain hissed against the window, a sound like a distant kitchen full of pots and iron spoons clattering in the storm. The old man spoke first with a throat that rasped with decades of smoke, dust and what the war had left behind, a voice thick with the memory of cold days, of fear and hunger, of men who had been brothers once and then were strangers. He did not look away from the reporter, but his gaze shifted, the edges of a memory blurring and sharpening with every breath. "Sit," he rasped, his hand gesturing to the chair. "If you're here to listen, listen hard. This is about more than war stories. It's about what we become when the world forgets to bake us bread." The reporter swallowed, teeth tapping the edge of a pencil. "You've lived past all the numbers the textbooks gave us. They say you kept your secret longer than any man born in your time. They say you're the last survivor of that war who can still tell the truth about it." A bitter smile cracked Corentin's weathered face, a line etched by years of weather and worry. "Truth," he said softly, almost to the wall as if the plaster might answer back, "is a stubborn thing. It sticks to breath and memory even when the world tries to sweep it under the rug of history." The room seemed to lean closer, as if it, too, wanted to hear something that could be called fact, something that could stand up in front of a jury of distant ancestors and say, "This is what happened." Corentin's lips parted, and for a long moment the air filled with the scent of oil lamps and damp wool, with the faint coppery sting of old blood carried on the winter wind from the town's river. He lifted his hands, then let them fall to his thighs. Palms pressed into the threadbare fabric, as if he could press away the memory with the weight of his own skin. "I am old," he began, and the words trembled at the edge of fear or perhaps pity or both. "Old enough to have learned not to speak the kind of words that make a man blush or shiver. Yet some words will not stay buried, not if a man's memory is as bright as the fire in this stove, when a cousin once whispered about ghosts in the attic." The reporter scribbled with quick, jittery strokes, trying to catch every syllable, every pause that braided memory with truth. The old man's eyes gleamed with a kind of lucid honesty, unpolished and dangerous in its clarity. "Do you want the truth of the war, or the truth of what I did when the world turned its back on us?" Corentin asked almost with a sigh, as if choosing which flame to feed. The reporter pressed the edge of the notebook closer. "Both, if you'll give them to us. The town deserves it. And history deserves it, and I deserve it. And you deserve not to carry this alone another day." The old man studied the reporter's face, a canvas of youth and fear and courage all at once. Then he nodded faintly, as if conceding a battle in his own mind, and began, "I was a boy of the Arkansas hills when the war came home to us like a fever. The first march, the first breath of smoke, the smell of iron and cordite that clings to the air even now in places where the river runs slow and muddy. We ran roads that no maps show anymore, and we learned to live on a thread of bread and a sip of water, and whatever the earth offered when the sun forgot to rise." He paused, listening to the room listen back, as if the walls could remember the sound of boots in the snow, the clatter of a wagon over frozen mud, the distant thump of a drum beat that kept time with a heartbeat. "There were 6 comrades whom I thought of as my brothers," he began again, his voice lowering to a whisper, as if he dared not disturb the evening's stillness with his own confession. "We called ourselves a unit, a small unit, a stubborn thing made for endurance in a country that did not want to endure us." The reporter's pencil hovered over the page, ready, as if the act of writing could seal a truth for all time, and not merely preserve it for a moment's memory. We did not talk much about what it meant to eat another man, Corentin continued. This is not a story about the moral arithmetic of war, the numbers, the courage, the losses. It is a story about the edge of a line a man can cross, and the quiet, heavy footprint left behind after you retreat from crossing it. The reporter shifted, the chair creaking under the movement, the floorboards sighing with the weight of old secrets that would not stay hidden beneath the surface of a well-ordered life. "Tell me how it began," the reporter said, voice steady and careful. "Tell me what forced you to a choice that you could never unmake." The old man's eyes closed, as if to shut out a memory that would not stay shut. The room's light glowed around him, throwing a halo of gold on the fringe of his hair and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, as if the flame were approving or perhaps warning him to speak. "It began with hunger," he said at last. "Real hunger. The kind that gnaws your days and your nights, that makes you count the ribs of a man across a fire, as if you could count the days left in your own life. We were in the mountains then, in a valley that wasn't in the maps anymore because we were always moving, always marching, always listening for the telltale crack of a shell or the crack of a branch under a winter footstep." The reporter felt the weight of the memory press against his ribs, the way the war pressed on every man who survived it, the way the memory pressed on the living to bear witness, sometimes to a fault. 6 became a number then, the old man whispered, almost as though he feared the line might vanish if spoken aloud. 6 of us, and maybe more if you count the ones who vanished into the night, the ones who did not stand by the fire to drink the last of the coffee. We lived through days when the sun wouldn't rise with mercy, when the rain never gave us a proper wash, when a man would swallow his fear and his breath and whatever else he could to keep from dying of the cold. Corentin's hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them together as though to stop their tremor from becoming an action. "Rumors traveled," he continued, voice lower still, "that the enemy did not give mercy either. We learned to think of mercy as a thing you could steal from a day when the world's mercy seemed to have run dry. We learned to forget the faces of the living when the night pressed in and the hunger pressed harder." The journalist's breath caught in his throat. He asked almost between breaths, "And the 6? "The 6 became more than 6 in the telling of that time," Corentin said, a gloomy, almost tender light coming into his eyes now, a look that suggested he was both ashamed of what he had to say and ashamed of not saying it sooner. They were comrades who had seen as much as we had seen, who had trusted each other with something that is not spoken aloud. That life, beneath the skin of a man, can become a thing you barter with, a thing you barter away. The reporter kept his pen moving, each stroke a little louder than the last, as if the act of writing could straighten the crooked lines of memory into something lawful, something that would stand in a courtroom of time and be accepted. "One night," Corentin began again, and the words came out in a voice barely above a whisper, "we were trapped. A column was gone, the supply line cut, and we were far from any shelter or shelter's promise. We had nothing left except a few stale biscuits and a bottle of rainwater that tasted of iron. We sat in a hollow, the wind in the trees sounding like a crowd of voices you couldn't trust, the kind that could see you but not help you. It was then that the idea, no, the necessity, shadowed into something monstrous." "Monstrous," the reporter echoed, and the word fell between them like a coin dropping into a well. "Yes," Corentin said, with a bare honesty that felt both shocking and necessary. "Not because we wanted to become monsters, but because we were men. And a man who has nothing left to give to a hunger that gnaws his old bones and his old heart, he imagines a way to keep someone else alive, a way to keep a piece of himself alive. It is not an argument you win on a courtroom bench. It is a fight you fight with nothing but your own conscience and the memory of your mother's kitchen and her bread that never tasted as good after the war as it did before it." The reporter set the pencil down for a moment, letting the weight of the confession settle into the space between them. The room's clock ticked with a stubborn if quiet insistence, as if time itself demanded that this moment be filled with truth. "Go on," the reporter said softly. "Tell me what happened." The old man's gaze drifted to the stove, to the crackling heat that did not seem to reach him, but warmed his chest with some impossible warmth. Then he looked back at the reporter with a distant, almost blank face. "Desperation is a loud thing," he said. "A man hears its voice and does not know where it comes from or where it will lead him. We found our 6, or what remained of them, after a day that stretched into a night that had no end. They lay close to the edge of the fire, the embers' heat fighting the cold that had gnawed at them long enough to drain the life from their bodies. I did what was necessary, or so I told myself. And then I did what a man should never do, what a man should never have to do to another human being. The journalist's pen moved faster than his breath. He dared not miss the next syllable. And you ate them? Corentin did not answer immediately. His breath came slow, as if every word cost him a little more air to breathe. Then at last he whispered, I did. Not all at once, not every day. The memory of their faces, especially the one who was the bravest of them all, stayed with me. The night after, we cut away parts of their bodies, not to revel in cruelty, but because we believed that if we did not, we would die ourselves, and we would drag the rest of them into graves with us. We ate to survive. It is a moral wrong that memory will always remind us of, long after the war has forgotten its own. Silence settled in the room with the thick presence of a snowfall. The rain outside intensified in its percussion against the glass, as if the weather itself wanted to bear witness to the story. The old man cleared his throat, and a line of sweat trickled down his temple despite the cool room air. 6, he repeated, almost as if to fix the number to the memory in his mind, to keep it from dissolving into the fog of time. 6 comrades. It haunted me then, it haunts me now. It is not something a man should forget, nor something a man should be asked to tell. The reporter's eyes sank to the notebook, to the lines drawn by the scrawled letters. He could almost hear the old man's memory speaking through the pen's nib, each mark a tremor of fear, guilt, and an almost childlike desire to be understood. Why reveal it now? The reporter asked, the words heavier than the breath he took to enunciate them. What changed for you to say this after so long? Corentin's lips trembled as if he wanted to smile, but could not bring himself to. Because I am tired of living in a story that cannot be told unless someone dies of old age first to hear it. Because the war is not a museum piece. It lives in every breath of the living who survived, in every letter written about the dead who cannot answer back. Because truth is not mercy. It is a memory that refuses to die. The room's walls seemed to lean closer again, listening to the confession as if they too needed to hear, to know the truth that would shape the town's future memory of itself. The reporter's voice softened. Do you fear what happens next? If people find out, which they will, about your 6 comrades and what you did, what will they do with that knowledge? Corentin looked away, toward the window where the rain grew heavier, and the river beyond the town lay dark and patient, a mirror of what a man becomes when his own history overpowers him. They will talk, he said at last, almost in a whisper. They will judge, condemn, forgive, forget, or pretend nothing happened. Some will want to erase the memory. Others will try to frame it as a necessity, born of a different era's cruelty. I fear only not being believed. I fear living with the image of their faces every night. The way the stars look down on a field after a battle it cannot reconcile. The reporter's hand paused in the air, the page poised to capture the next words, the next sentence that would close the ledger of this man's life, with the Civil War as its stern, unyielding signature. Will you share the names of those men? The reporter asked, a tremor of cruelty or compassion in his voice, perhaps both. The townsfolk deserve to know who you speak of. Corentin's eyes flicked toward the reporter with a quiet caution. Names can become a bear trap, he said. Names can sanction a judgment or incite a curse. If you print the names, you give them power to hurt again. If you leave them out, you let the memory stay as a shadow that can strangle a village with rumor. The reporter considered this. The idea of speaking a name in a small town with close ties to the old war and the old wounds of it. He looked down at his notebook, at the damp ink where the river's breath and the rain had touched the page. He could hear the town's clock in the distance, a stubborn metronome that had counted out the years since a battle not fought on this land, but in every heart that refused to forget. Tell me, the reporter pressed, what happened to the 6? How did the story end, so we can understand the full weight of what you carried? Corentin shifted in his chair, the wood groaning under the weight of a memory that had waited for decades to surface, to be spoken aloud, to be weighed. The end, he said, and his voice steadied with effort. The end was not a trial. It was a march back, a line drawn by a compass that had gone dull in the hands of men who could not explain what they did to live another day. The 6 died there in that cold hollow, not by the enemy's blade, not by the quick slash of a saber, but by the silent knife of hunger and the decided thought that one must live and one must die, and One's survival cannot be measured by mercy, but by the memory of those moments that follow you into every breath you draw afterward. A long pause followed. The reporter's eyes, so young and hungry for truth, flickered with something like awe, something not unlike fear for what he would unleash upon the town with these truths. People will come asking questions, the reporter murmured. Press will descend with cameras and questions. They'll want to know whether the six were family men or neighbors, or strangers who spoke softly, and offered a thin loaf of bread and a sly smile in the same breath. They'll want to know how you could do this, and how you could bear living with it. The old man watched the rain trace its way down the window pane, each drop a tiny pilgrim on a glass road, on its slow journey away from the room's warmth to some unknown cold outside. "I cannot tell you the names of all six," Corentin replied, his voice still a tremoring echo of years that would not stay quiet. "But I can tell you this. They were men who shared the same fear as I did. They spoke the language of a road that ran out of bread and hope. They trusted me, and I betrayed that trust with a choice that cannot be undone without the blood of memory itself. I am not seeking forgiveness from any single man. I am seeking forgiveness from what I did to the memory of what we were once." The reporter's hands trembled at the weight of such confession. He lowered his eyes, letting the gravity of what he'd heard sink in. The room's stillness a heavy curtain around them, the stove's pale flame a small, stubborn witness. "Do you want the truth told in the sunlight, or do you want it told in the long shadow of the town?" the reporter asked, his voice now a measured instrument, careful not to push the old man into a corner, where there was no air to breathe. The question hung between them for a heartbeat that stretched into silence longer than a breath, until the old man finally spoke. "A little of both," he said, almost as if he'd finally found a way to balance the scales. "Let the truth emerge with the dawn of your town's memory, but let it arrive without the flash of cameras that would turn my confession into a spectacle. Let it arrive as a living memory, not a show." The rain intensified, beating against the roof with a hammering rhythm that seemed almost to drum out a cadence of the war. The gas lamp in the corner coughed, blew a thin wisp of smoke, and steadied again as if the room itself steadied with it, coaxing the old man to take a breath and go on. "3 days after that night in the hollow, we moved again," Corentin continued, his voice lifting slightly with the memory's momentum. "We pressed forward, as men do when they have nothing to lose but the memory of themselves. The bodies lay cold in the earth, hidden beneath the snow that would not melt for weeks. We marked their resting place with sticks and a small cairn we built from the stone we found in the hillside. We did not talk of them again, not in the daylight, not in the quiet hours when our eyelids grew heavy with sleep that would not come. We were taught to bury what the war asked us to bury, and to pretend it never happened while the world still asked us to live." The reporter tilted his head, listening to the cadence of the old man's memory, which moved with the precision of a drumbeat, but carried the irregular rhythm of a confession's tremor. "Would you tell me the names?" the reporter asked again, more gently this time. Corentin's lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked at the reporter with a level gaze that could have cut stone. "No more names," he said almost sternly. "Names tempt the living into the arena of judgment, and judgment can turn a town into a battlefield again. I am tired of battles fought with tongues and headlines. If you write their names, you bind the memory to a single moment of anger or piety in the season's heat. If you leave them unnamed, you let them become a memory that can be carried by the wind into every home, every church, every doorway, until the whole town learns to live with them as a shared burden." The reporter absorbed this, the words landing with the dull thud of a coin dropped into a pocket. He looked up, saw the old man's stern, pale profile lit by the stove's glow, and realized this was not a sensational revelation to be exploited, but a memory to be set down carefully, not to hurt the living but to honor the dead, if honor is possible for such acts, in such times. The night wore on in the same patient way memory wears on a life, slowly, with small, almost imperceptible changes that add up to something unrecognizable by the next day. The old man spoke little after that, only answering the reporter's inquiries with careful, economical phrases. The reporter, for his part, asked questions that did not seek to condemn so much as to understand. The war's mercies and the war's mercilessness, the survival instinct and the cost of survival. The quiet screaming inside a man when the world finally stops listening to his memory. Toward the small hours, the old man's breath shortened, and his chest rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested sleep would be a luxury, beyond his years. The reporter gathered his notes, the notebook heavy with the weight of a truth that could outlive the small town's patience and the reporter's career. As dawn threatened the horizon with a pale, reluctant light, Corentin spoke once more, perhaps to give the journalist one last anchor for this confession. The war left us with a memory that no man should own entirely, and no town should be proud of openly. If you print what I have told you, print it as a cautionary tale. A warning about hunger, fear, and the choices a man can make when mercy has no bread left to give. If you do not print it, you will be carrying it on your own shoulders, and you will pass it to your children's children as a rumor that outran the facts. The reporter stood, notebook in hand, the room's cold air catching his breath in his chest, squeezing it into a whisper of awe and fear. "I will write it," he said, "in a way that honors your memory and does not betray the dead you carried in your memory, even if those names must remain unsaid." Corentin nodded, a slow, sure motion that spoke of resignation and relief both. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory would slip away if he did not keep it pressed to his brain with the stubborn force of will. The morning light strengthened, pale and stubborn, touching the edges of the stove with a light cold that crept into the corners of the room. The reporter's shoes squeaked on the wooden floor as he moved toward the door, then paused, turning to look at the old man one last time. "Will you tell me if the river lies?" the reporter asked, stepping toward the door with the journal in hand, the memory of the confession already spilling onto the page. Corentin's eyes opened slowly, meeting the reporter's for a long, clear moment. "The river lies only if you pretend it does," he replied simply. "It remembers everything you have done and everything you have forgotten. It does not forgive. It does not forget. It simply moves on like time itself." The reporter nodded, knowing the conversation was ending, but also knowing deep down that some conversations never truly end. They echo in the rooms of towns and in the hearts of men who cannot forget. And then, with a rustle of clothing and a final glance at the old man's weathered face, the map of a life drawn in lines and memories, then the journalist stepped into the cold morning and began to bend memory toward the light. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with discussion, with the rumor of a confession that sounded like a lighthouse in a fog-bound bay, guiding some and alarming others. The report spread beyond the town, and readers found themselves asking questions they had long avoided. What does it mean to survive? What does it mean to keep a memory alive when that memory bears the stain of something monstrous? What is the price of telling the truth about a war that refused to end in the hearts of its victors? Corentin Harrow lay quiet in his bed as the town spoke for him. His room smelled of cold rain, of old wool, and of the faint, stubborn ember of a life that had burned for more than a century. The night sounds returned, the town's distant train whistle, a dog barking somewhere far away, the soft sigh of a house as it settled, as if it too exhaled after a long, hard day of watching and waiting. In the end, the confession did not alter the war's history on state lines or battle maps. It altered something quieter and more intimate, the town's memory of itself, the way it saw the frailty and ferocity of men who had walked through fire and could still walk a little more, even if they carried the fire in their bones. It altered the way the living told their own stories, and the way a younger generation learned to listen to a few stubborn truths with gravity rather than gleeful sensationalism. The old man's days remained measured by the slow, careful pulse of his breath. He did not live as long after the confession as the memory would desire. Age is a thief who visits every home with a different schedule. Yet the confession did what it set out to do. It forced a community to confront a reality it had long preferred to forget, and it compelled the living to face a history that would rather be a rumor than a reckoning. One late afternoon, as the river outside turned the color of old pennies and the wind carried the scent of damp earth through the town, the old man lay with eyes closed, listening to the house breathe. The night's quiet came softly, and the room's light glowed with a patient glow, a small sun in a winter sky. The last thing he spoke before sleep took him was the line that had haunted him all these years, that had gnawed at him in the long silence of days, a single sentence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock and the whisper of the rain beyond the glass. "I thought the secret would die with me." And with that, Corentin Harrow's breath left him on a calm exhale, the body finally giving in to the long war he had survived in body, and, perhaps more difficult, in memory. The town's rising sun found him quiet in the room, the fear and relief coexisting in the faces of those who had come to witness the truth in their own way, each person choosing how to carry it into the day, as a cautionary tale, as a burden to be shouldered, or as a confession that could finally rest, not in the mind of a man, but in the hard, unsoftened ground of history. And so the memory endured, not as a spectacle, but as a memory, told, retold, weighed, and finally accepted in the quiet way a small town can accept what it cannot fully understand. The truth had arrived in the early hours, with the rain's quiet insistence and the old man's final breath, and in that moment, the living began again to reckon with the quiet, terrible nuance of survival, guilt, and what a man can carry long after the war ends. The older townsfolk spoke softly about it in the evenings. The younger ones listened with wide eyes, and nobody could say for certain whether this confession would mend what the war had broken in their history, or simply punctuate the silence with a new, more difficult memory. But for Corentin Harrow, the truth, however heavy, had finally found its place. In the honesty of a life lived under the long, hard shadow of a war that could not be rewritten, only reframed in the minds of those who dared to listen. And so the story rested there, in that little room in that old house on a river that kept moving, carrying away the day's memory, and returning it with the next morning's light. The last survivor's confession had come at last, spoken by a tired mouth, and received by a town that would forever carry it with them, like a scar that won't heal, yet teaches every new generation to tread softly where the memory walks. The words remained, whispered against the wall.